The pilot laughed at him first. That is how it started, not with a punch or a shove, but with a laugh, the easy, carrying laugh of a man who has never once in his life been told to wait outside. We were lined along the garden terrace of Highmore House, 8 of us in full ceremonial order, and the laugh came rolling up the steps before the man who made it. "Look at that," he said to the woman on his arm, loud enough for the whole receiving line to hear. "They've got toy soldiers guarding the cake." I am Corporal Wren Halloway, and the man he was pointing at was Sergeant Eli Mercer, who stood at the foot of the terrace stair, rifle at his shoulder, eyes fixed on the middle distance, and did not so much as blink. I should tell you who the pilot was, because for one afternoon his name was on every banner over the lawn. Dax Corvell, the headline act of the Highmore Air Pageant, a charity flypast thrown by the fictional House of Aldermere to raise money for a children's hospital wing. Corvell flew, a sleek aerobatic machine painted the color of a wasp, and he was, by every account printed in that morning's program, the finest display pilot anyone had ever paid to watch fall out of the sky on purpose. He had the watch, the jacket, the sunglasses he did not take off indoors. He had 3 cameras following him and a publicist with a clipboard. And he had decided, somewhere between the champagne tent and the terrace, that the most amusing thing he could do with all that attention was point it at a man who was not allowed to point anything back. "Do they wind them up in the morning?" Corvell asked the publicist, and she laughed the way people laugh when their paycheck depends on it. He stepped closer to Mercer, close enough that I felt my own jaw tighten 3 men down the line. Hey, statue, you ever actually do anything, or do you just stand here while the rest of us go up there and earn it?" He jerked his thumb at the sky, where his own wasp-colored aircraft sat gleaming on the grass strip beyond the Rose Walk, waiting for the afternoon's show. Mercer did not move. Of course he did not. That is the whole of the job, and Mercer was better at it than any man I have ever served beside. But I had stood at his shoulder for 2 years, and I knew the difference between the stillness of a man who has nothing inside him and the stillness of a man holding a great deal very, very carefully. Mercer was the second kind. I could not have told you, that afternoon, what he was holding. I only knew it was heavy. "Nothing," Corvell announced to the terrace, spreading his hands. "See, nothing. That's the bravest thing in the empire, ladies and gentlemen, a man whose entire job is to not flinch while somebody else takes all the risk." He grinned. "Boring, safe little job, I'd lose my mind." A few of the guests laughed, most did not. There is a particular quiet that comes over a crowd when one man is being cruel to another who cannot answer, and that quiet was settling over the garden terrace like a cloud crossing the sun. Corvell felt it and mistook it for awe. What he could not know, what none of them could know, was that of every person standing on that lawn, in that champagne tent, in that whole bright pageant of engines and ribbons and brave, beautiful flying. The man he had just called a coward had pulled more living people out of more wreckage than any other soul present, including, though it would take the rest of the afternoon to come out, Dax Corvell himself. But I am ahead of the story. Let me bring it back. The pageant had been 3 months in the planning. The House of Aldermere did one of these every summer, and this year the proceeds were going to the new children's wing at the county hospital, which meant the lawns of Highmore were thick with families, with hospital staff in their good clothes, with small fierce-eyed boys clutching toy planes. Our detachment had drawn the ceremonial duty: line the terrace, hold the stair, stand the static posts while the great and the good drifted between marquees, and at 4 o'clock present arms for the flypast that would close the day. A long, hot, polished afternoon. The kind of duty Corvell would have called boring, and he would have been right, and that is exactly the point of it. Ceremony is the part of duty that looks like nothing is happening. The whole art of it is to make safety look like ease. Mercer had drawn the foot of the stair, the most visible post on the terrace, because Mercer always drew the hardest post. Our sergeant of the guard, Color Sergeant Vane, gave it to him the way you give the heaviest pack to the strongest man, without comment, because it does not need one. Mercer had stood that morning's inspection without a thread out of place. His tunic was the deep red the regiment is known for, his bearskin sat perfectly level, his white gloves were spotless, and on his breast he wore a single ribbon I had asked him about exactly once early on and never again. He had told me in 5 words that it was from the service, and the way he said before had a door in it, and I had the sense not to knock. Now that door was about to be opened by a man who flew planes for a living and thought courage was something you could only do at altitude. Corvell was not finished. Men like him are never finished. The silence of the crowd only made him reach for more. "Come on," he said, and now he was performing for his cameras, walking a slow circle around Mercer the way a buyer circles a horse. "Give us something. One blink, one twitch, anything to prove there's a man in there and not just a coat rack." He looked back at his publicist. "Get this. This is gold." I watched a vein stand out on the back of my own sergeant's gloved hand where it gripped the rifle, and that was all. That was the entire visible cost of what it took for Eli Mercer to keep his eyes on the middle distance, while a stranger in sunglasses called him hollow in front of 200 people. To everyone else he was a statue. To me, he was a dam. And then a small voice said, "He's not boring." It came from low down, near Corvell's elbow. A boy 8, perhaps 9, in a hospital wing t-shirt with a cartoon plane on it, holding the hand of a tired-looking woman who must have been his mother. He had wandered up the steps with the bold incaution of a child who does not yet understand that some adults are dangerous. He was glaring up at Corvell with the full ferocity of his small frame. "He's not boring," the boy said again. "Guards are the bravest. Everybody knows that." Corvell, to his credit or his ruin, laughed and crouched to the boy's level. "Yeah, what's brave about standing still, champ? I fly upside down at 400 miles an hour. He stands on a step." He flicked a glance up at Mercer, milking it. "Ask him. Ask the statue what's the bravest thing he ever did, but he can't even answer, but he's not allowed." It was a cheap thing to do, to use a child as a prop in his own joke. But the boy did not understand he was being used. He looked up at Mercer with enormous, hopeful eyes, and in the simple cruelty of the moment, he asked the one question the whole afternoon had been circling. "What's the bravest thing you ever did, mister?" And Eli Mercer, who had not moved, who had not spoken, who had stood like cut stone through every insult Dax Corvell could throw, Eli Mercer looked down at that boy. Just for a moment. Just long enough for me to see something cross his face that I had never seen there before. Then he looked forward again and said nothing, and the moment closed. But I had seen it, and I understood in the space of that one downward glance that whatever the bravest thing Eli Mercer had ever done was, it had cost him more than this entire arrogant crowd had spent in their lives, and that he had no intention of ever telling them what it was. The boy's mother drew him gently away with an apologetic look that took in both Mercer and me, and Corvell straightened up, dusting his knees as though he had won something. "There you go," he said. Even the kid couldn't get a word out of him. He clapped the publicist on the shoulder. "Right, I'm on at 4. Let's get me up there before I die of boredom down here with the furniture." He swept off toward the Rose Walk and his waiting aircraft, and the receiving line breathed out, and the afternoon resumed its bright ordinary business as though nothing had happened. To anyone watching, nothing had. A man had mocked a guard, the guard had not reacted, the man had grown bored and left. The oldest scene in our line of work. By tea time it would be a story the guests told at dinner, and Mercer would be the punchline. I could not let it sit. When Color Sergeant Vane rotated the posts at 3:30, and Mercer stepped back into the shaded colonnade for his 10 minutes of stand easy, I followed him. He had his bearskin off and tucked under his arm, and he was looking out across the lawn at the wasp-colored aircraft on the grass strip, where Corvell's ground crew were fussing over it like courtiers. "You shouldn't have to take that, Sergeant," I said. "It's the job, Halloway." He did not look at me. "Taking it is the job. The day I answer a man like that is the day I've stopped doing it." He called you a coward. He called a uniform a coward. He doesn't know me. There's no insult in being misjudged by a man who hasn't looked. He said it without heat, the way he said most things, but his eyes had not left the aircraft. Pretty machine, he added almost to himself. Light, forgiving if you know how to ask it nicely, brutal if you don't. That stopped me. You know that aeroplane. I know the type. A long pause. The ground crew rolled the canopy back and the afternoon sun caught the cockpit glass. I knew a lot of types once before this. He touched the single ribbon on his breast, one gloved fingertip, the smallest gesture, and then took his hand away as though he had caught himself doing something private. Different service. Long time ago. What service? He looked at me then, and there was the faintest line at the corner of his mouth that on a less disciplined man might have been a smile. The boring, safe kind, he said. The kind where nothing ever happens. And he put his bearskin back on and squared it, and went back out to the foot of the stair, and that was all I got from him. But it was enough to set me wondering, because I had served beside Eli Mercer for 2 years, and I had never heard him volunteer a single word about before. And now, on the one afternoon a stranger had thrown his courage in his face. The door I had learned not to knock on had drifted open an inch on its own. I want to be honest about what I knew and when I knew it, because the temptation in telling a story like this is to pretend I understood everything as it unfolded. I did not. At 3:30, I knew only that my sergeant had a past he kept locked, that the past involved aircraft, and that a famous pilot had just spent 20 minutes mocking him for a kind of courage the pilot did not have the imagination to recognize. The rest came out in pieces over the hour that followed, and then all at once, the way the truth of a man usually does, not because he tells you, but because life puts him in front of you and stops pretending. The thing that put Eli Mercer in front of me that afternoon was the weather. You would not have known it to look at the sky at 3:30. It was the kind of high blue summer afternoon they put on postcards, a few fat white clouds idling over the hills to the west, the air over the lawn still and warm and smelling of cut grass and aviation fuel. But the western hills are where Highmore's weather is born, and I had stood enough static posts in that county to have learned to watch them. By 3:45, those fat white clouds had stopped idling. They had begun to stack, to build upward and inward, the bottoms of them flattening and darkening, the tops boiling up into anvils. The still warm air had developed an edge. Somewhere a long way off, too far yet to be sure of, I thought I heard the sky clear its throat. I was not the only one who noticed. Up on the terrace, near the marquee where the house party stood, I saw a man in a high-visibility tabard, the pageant's flight director. I learned later, a former service pilot named Captain Orsk, talking urgently into a handheld radio and pointing at the western hills. I saw Corvell's publicist hurry across the lawn toward him. I saw the two of them argue, the publicist gesturing at the crowd, at the cameras, at the great banner that read 4 o'clock, the CORVELLE display, and the flight director shaking his head and pointing, again and again, at the sky. I could not hear the words from where I stood, but I have flown enough times since and talked to enough men who do it for a living to be able to write the argument now with some confidence. The flight director was telling Corvell's people that the front coming off the hills was moving faster than forecast, that a display of low aerobatics under a building storm was a fool's errand, that the prudent thing, the boring, safe thing was to cancel the show, refund nothing, and send everyone home dry. And Corvell's people were telling him that 200 families and a children's hospital and 3 cameras and a man who had never canceled a show in his life were all waiting for 4 o'clock, and that a little weather had never stopped Dax Corvell. I know how the argument ended, because at 3 minutes to 4 the great banner did not come down. The tan crackled, and a smooth voice asked the guests to make their way to the viewing line for the afternoon's main event. And out on the grass strip, the wasp-colored aircraft's engine coughed, caught, and rose to a hard, bright snarl. And Dax Corvell taxied out to fly into a sky that was, by then, the dirty, bruised purple of an old wound, with the first cold gusts already flattening the marquee canvas and snapping the banners straight out from their poles. Mercer, at the foot of the stair, turned his head a half-inch and looked at the sky. It was the first thing I had seen him do all day that was not strictly required of him. He looked at the building storm, and at the little aircraft climbing into the teeth of it, and his face did something I can only describe as old. As though he had seen this exact thing before, a long time ago, and it had ended in a way he had spent the rest of his life carrying. "Holloway," he said, very quietly without turning, "where's the boy?" "Sergeant." "The one who asked me the question, the hospital boy, where is he?" I scanned the viewing line and found him, front and center of course, hoisted onto his tired mother's hip so he could see, his cartoon-plain t-shirt bright against the darkening lawn, his small face turned up to the sky in pure delight as the wasp-colored machine clawed for height above him. "Viewing line dead center," I said, "front row." Mercer said nothing, but his gloved hand, the one not on the rifle, had closed slowly into a fist at his side, and I realized that for the first time in 2 years I was watching my sergeant be afraid, not for himself, never for himself, but for everyone under that sky who did not yet know what he knew. And what he knew, I would learn in about 90 seconds, was exactly what happens to a light aircraft when a man too proud to cancel flies it into a storm above a crowd of children. The first part of the display was beautiful. I will give Corvell that even now. He took the Wasp up to height and rolled it through a series of climbing turns that drew gasps from the line, the engine note rising and falling like something alive, the trail of white smoke he laid behind him scrawling loops against the bruised cloud. The boy on his mother's hip shrieked with joy. For perhaps 90 seconds, Dax Corvell was everything the banner promised, and the storm behind him only made him look braver, a tiny, bright, defiant thing against a wall of dark. Then the wall of dark reached out and took hold of him. I have had the physics explained to me since, by men who fly, and I will set it down plainly because the plain version is the frightening one. A storm front is not just rain and noise. It is a great churning engine of moving air, columns of it driving up, columns of it crashing down, the two slamming past each other along the leading edge with a violence no light aircraft is built to argue with. A pilot caught in it does not fall, exactly. He is seized. The air he was riding stops being a road and becomes a sea in a gale, and the little machine that was dancing a moment ago is suddenly a leaf. Corvell was at the top of a loop when the front's leading gust hit him, and I saw the wasp-colored aircraft simply stop being his. One instant it was carving a clean arc, the next it had been knocked sideways, flat and skidding, the white smoke trail kinking into a broken zigzag. The engine note, which had been a confident snarl, climbed into a thin, frightened whine. The aircraft dropped a wing, caught it, dropped the other and began, there is no gentle word for it, to fall. Not in a dive he had chosen. In the ugly, tumbling, sideways way of a thing that is no longer being flown. The crowd's gasps turned to something else. A long, rising note of fear ran down the viewing line. Somewhere a woman screamed. The tan voice, which had been narrating the display in its smooth, bright tones, said, "And Dax now showing us a," and then stopped mid-word, because even the man on the microphone could see that what we were watching was not a maneuver. And in the middle of all of it, while 200 people stood frozen with their faces turned up and their hands at their mouths, Sergeant Eli Mercer came to life. He did not shout. He did not break ranks in a wild rush. What he did was worse, in its way, and far more terrible to watch because it was so exact. He took 2 steps forward off his post, the first unauthorized steps I had ever seen him take, and his head moved, tracking the falling aircraft with the flat, unhurried sweep of a man reading instruments. And when he spoke, it was not to the crowd and not to me but to himself, low and fast, the language of a trade I did not know he spoke. "He's into the downdraft. He's going to firewall it, and he's wrong. He's chasing the nose." A pause as the engine whine spiked. There, he's overcorrected. He's in a spin entry. If he doesn't centralize and unload, he's going into the Rose Walk. His voice never rose. It was the calmest voice on that entire lawn, and it was describing a man's death in real time. Holloway, get the line back. Now, behind the gravel walk, all of them, the front of the crowd is under the fall line. Move them. I did not ask how he knew. There was no room in the moment for it. I turned and I bellowed at the crowd in the parade ground voice they train into you. And Color Sergeant Vane caught it instantly, and the rest of the detachment broke from their posts without an order because they could see what I could see. And between the 8 of us, we put our hands and our bodies against that frozen crowd, and we drove them back off the front lawn, back behind the gravel walk. The boy and his mother and the families and the hospital staff stumbling backward up the slope, while above us the wasp-colored aircraft screamed and tumbled and came down. It did not hit the crowd. I want to say that plainly and early, because the boy in the cartoon t-shirt is alive and grown now, and so is his mother, and so is everyone who stood on that lawn. The aircraft missed them. But it missed them by the width of a held breath, because in the last seconds Corvell did something right, got the nose down, got the wings level for 1 instant, traded the spin for a long, flat, dreadful skid, and the Wasp came in low and fast across the Rose Walk, and struck the ornamental lake at the bottom of the gardens in a great brown gout of water and a sound like the world being dropped. And then there was silence, the real kind, the kind I have only heard a few times in my life, when something has happened that is too large for a crowd to make noise about. The aircraft was in the lake, not floating, sinking, nose down, the tail standing up out of the brown water at a broken angle, the canopy half submerged. Steam or smoke, I could not tell which, rose off the wreck in a thin gray ribbon. And Dax Corvell, the finest display pilot anyone had ever paid to watch, the man who flew upside down at 400 miles an hour and called my sergeant a coward, was trapped inside it, under the rising water, in front of the 200 people he had wanted so badly to impress. Nobody moved. The flight director, Orsk, was running down the slope shouting into his radio for the fire crews, who were stationed on the far side of the airfield and would take minutes to come around. The crowd stood at the gravel walk in stunned horror. Corvell's publicist had sat down on the grass. The boy in the t-shirt had buried his face in his mother's shoulder. And Eli Mercer was already moving. He went past me at a dead run, and as he ran he stripped. The bearskin came off and hit the lawn. The rifle he handed to me without breaking stride actually put it into my hands, the most sacred and unbreakable rule of our entire service. A guardsman does not relinquish his weapon, and he did it without a flicker, because there was a thing that needed doing and the rifle would only drown. The white gloves came off as he ran, the tunic's top buttons too, and by the time he hit the edge of the lake he had shed everything that would slow a man in water. And the last thing I saw before he went in was that single ribbon on his bare breast catching the stormlight. And at last, far too late to be of any use to Dax Corvell's opinion of him, I understood what it was. It was the ribbon they give a man who has gone into the water after other men, the highest of its kind. You do not earn it standing still on a step. You earn it the way Eli Mercer was earning it again right now, in front of all of us, by going into a sinking wreck after a stranger who had spent the afternoon laughing at him. I had the rifle in my hands and the bearskin on the grass and my whole body screaming to follow him, and Color Sergeant Vane's hand came down hard on my shoulder. "Hold the line, Holloway," he said, low. "Keep them back. Let the sergeant work." And I understood that Vane knew. Vane had always known. He had given Mercer the hardest post every single day for 2 years, not because Mercer needed proving, but because Vane trusted him with it the way you trust the strongest man with the heaviest pack. And the heaviest pack, it turned out, was the one Mercer had been carrying the whole time in silence under that single ribbon. So I held the line. I stood at the gravel walk with 200 people pressed behind me, and I watched my sergeant swim. He swam the way he did everything, without waste. No splashing, no panic, just a flat, fast crawl across the brown water to where the tail of the wasp stood broken against the sky. He reached the wreck and he did not climb onto it, which I learned later is the thing untrained men get wrong, the thing that drowns the would-be rescuer alongside the man he came for. He stayed in the water, low, working the half-submerged canopy with his hands, reading the wreck with his fingers the way he had read the storm with his eyes. The aircraft was still sinking. The water was at the canopy rail and rising. Whatever Corvell was inside there, conscious, unconscious, trapped by a harness or a buckled frame, Mercer had perhaps a minute, and he spent the first 10 seconds of it not pulling but feeling, finding the latch, finding the angle, finding the one way this could be done that would not kill them both. Then the canopy went back, and Mercer reached in. I cannot tell you everything that happened in the next 40 seconds, because it happened under brown water and behind a broken wing, and I was 100 feet away holding back a crowd. I can tell you what we saw. We saw the tail of the aircraft slide down and disappear. We saw the brown water close over the place where the cockpit had been. We saw nothing. A long, terrible nothing. The longest stretch of empty water I have ever stared at, and the crowd behind me made that low rising note of fear again, and somewhere the boy was crying, and I thought, with a coldness that has never entirely left me, that I was about to watch 2 men die instead of 1, and that the second of them was worth more than the whole rest of that lawn put together. And then Eli Mercer's head broke the surface, and his arm was around Dax Corvell's chest, and he was swimming for the bank on his back, hauling the pilot's dead weight across the water 1 stroke at a time, his face turned up to the bruised and thundering sky with an expression of absolute, depthless calm. The fire crews reached the bank as Mercer reached it. They took Corvell from him, limp, gray, not breathing, and laid him on the grass and went to work, and Mercer hauled himself out of the lake and knelt over the pilot beside them and did the thing with his joined hands on the man's chest, the steady pressing rhythm, that I now know is the difference between a body and a man. He did it without being asked. He did it as though he had done it 1,000 times, because, as it turned out, he very nearly had. Corvell coughed up lake water on the count of perhaps 200. He coughed, and arched, and his gray face flushed with the ugly, beautiful red of a man whose heart has remembered what it is for, and the fire medics rolled him onto his side, and the breath that went into him was the loudest sound on that entire silent lawn. And the crowd, 200 people who an hour before had laughed, or half-laughed, or stayed politely quiet while a famous man called a guard a coward, the crowd did not cheer. That is the part I remember most. They did not cheer the way crowds cheer at a rescue in a film. They made a sound I have never heard before or since, a kind of broken collective gasp that turned into something close to weeping, because every single one of them had just understood, all at once and far too late, exactly which man on that lawn the word coward did not belong to. Mercer knelt back on his heels. He was soaked through, his ceremonial tunic ruined, his hair plastered down, the single ribbon dark with lake water on his heaving chest. He looked down at Dax Corvell breathing on the grass, and I watched him reach out, and this is the only tenderness I ever saw in the man, rest one bare hand briefly on the pilot's shoulder, the way you steady a frightened animal, before he stood up and stepped back to let the professionals work. That was when the questions started, because that is what crowds do once the terror passes. They reach for the story. Captain Orsk, the flight director, came up to Mercer dripping and shaking and said, "Where did you learn that? Who are you?" And one of the fire officers, an older man, was staring at Mercer with a strange, dawning expression, the expression of a man who has just placed a face he half knew. And a journalist who had come for the charity pageant and gotten something far larger was already pushing through with a recorder. Mercer did not answer any of them. He was looking around for his bearskin. But the older fire officer would not let it go. He kept staring, and then he said slowly, in the voice of a man saying something he can hardly believe, "I know you. I served the relief end of a job years back. The big one. The aircraft that went down off the coast in the night in the gale when they said no boat and no aircraft could reach it and the whole country sat up till morning watching the lights. He stopped. The lawn had gone quiet around him. There was a crewman who went down on the wire again and again, all night in the worst of it, and pulled out, I forget the number now, pulled out more living souls than anyone thought were left to pull. They wrote about him for weeks. He never gave his name, refused the parades. The boring man, the papers called him in the end because he wouldn't say a word about himself, the boring man who flew into the storm. The fire officer's voice cracked. That was you, wasn't it? That was you. Eli Mercer found his bearskin. He bent and picked it up off the wet grass and he straightened, and he settled it level on his head with two soaked white gloveless hands. And only then did he answer, not the fire officer, not the journalist, not the crowd, but in the general direction of the man still breathing on the grass at his feet. It was a long time ago, he said, different service, a breath, the boring, safe kind where nothing ever happens. And then he turned and he walked back up the slope through the parted crowd, water running off him, and he picked his way to the foot of the terrace stair, and he held out his hand to me for his rifle. I gave it back. He checked it even then, even soaked and spent. He checked it as the drill demands, and he settled it against his shoulder, and he turned his eyes to the middle distance, and he stood his post. That is the image I will carry of Eli Mercer to the end of my days. Not the swim, not the canopy, not the hand on the dying man's chest. The man who, having done all of that, simply went back to his step and stood still, because his shift was not over, and standing still was the job. The crowd did not let him be a statue this time, though. As the ambulance took Corvell away and the storm finally broke over us in honest rain, the families on that lawn began, one by one, to do a thing that is not in any protocol. They came to the foot of the stair in the rain and they stopped in front of the soaked and ruined guardsman, and they did not speak, because they could see he did not want them to, and they simply inclined their heads to him. Not a salute they had been taught. A salute they had invented on the spot, out of the only feeling big enough for the moment. The boy in the cartoon t-shirt came last, holding his mother's hand, and he looked up at Mercer with eyes that had seen something that afternoon he would spend his whole life trying to understand, and he did not ask his question again. He did not need to. He had his answer, and so did everyone else. Mercer stood his post until 6 o'clock, when the relief came and Color Sergeant Vane stood him down. He never spoke of it again. Not to the journalist, who chased him for a week and got nothing. Not to the house, who tried to give him a decoration he quietly declined, the way he had quietly declined the first one, all those years before. Not even much to me. The most he ever said about the whole affair, he said about a fortnight later, when the two of us were standing the dawn watch at the east gate, and the story was finally fading from the papers. "You want to ask me about it," he said, not unkindly, eyes forward. "Only if you want to tell me, Sergeant." A long quiet. The sky over Highmore was doing its gentle pink ordinary thing, no storm in it anywhere. "The night they wrote about," he said at last, "off the coast." There was a moment near the end of it when I'd been on the wire so many times the crew chief wanted to call it. Said there was nobody left alive down there worth the risk of one more drop, and he was probably right. The odds said he was right. He paused. I went down one more time anyway, and there was a man, half gone but a man alive who would have died in that water in the next 10 minutes if the boring, safe, sensible decision had been made up top. He shifted his weight, the smallest adjustment. I've thought about that man every day for 15 years, Holloway, not because of what I did, because of how close I came to listening to the sensible voice and leaving him there. He let that sit. "That's why I don't answer the Corvells of this world," he said. "A man like that thinks courage is the loud thing he does up in the sky where everyone can see. But the sky's the easy part. Anyone brave enough and proud enough will fly into a storm for a crowd. The hard part, the part nobody films, the part that doesn't get a banner, is standing on a step in the cold for 8 hours doing nothing, day after day after day, and keeping yourself ready. Ready for the 1 minute in 10 years when doing nothing stops being the job and doing everything starts. He couldn't see it, so he called it boring, a breath. Let him. The whole point of being ready is that you don't get to choose the day. I have turned that over many times in the years since, and I have come to think it is the truest thing anyone ever said to me about the work we do. As for Dax Corvell, he lived. He spent 3 days in the new children's wing his own crashed aeroplane had helped to raise money for, which is the kind of irony that would be too neat for fiction if it had not actually happened. And when he was well enough to leave, he did not slip away quietly the way I half expected a humbled man to do. He came back to Highmore. He came in a plain hire car, without the publicist, without the sunglasses, without a single camera, and he asked at the gate to speak to the guardsman who had pulled him out of the lake. Protocol does not allow a sentry to take visitors. But Color Sergeant Vane, who understood more than he ever said, arranged for the 2 men to meet for 5 minutes in the colonnade during Mercer's stand-easy, and because Vane trusted me, he let me stand within earshot in case the famous man caused trouble. He did not cause trouble. He stood in front of Eli Mercer, the man he had circled like a buyer circling a horse, the man he had called a coat rack, a statue, a coward, and for a long moment he could not get any words out at all. When he finally did, his voice was nothing like the carrying laugh from the receiving line. "I owe you my life," Corvell said. "And before that I owe you an apology, and I've never had to make one this size. I called you boring. I called you safe. I stood on that lawn and I told 200 people that what you do is nothing." He swallowed. "And then you put my own weapon back in your corporal's hands, and you went into the water after me when the sensible thing, the thing my own flight director was begging me to do all afternoon, was to leave well enough alone." He shook his head. "I flew into that storm to prove I was brave. You walked into it to save the man who'd insulted you. I don't think I understood, until I was lying on that grass, that those aren't the same thing at all." Mercer let him finish. Then he said simply, "You're alive, that's the part that matters, the rest you can keep." A pause. "Fly the sensible way from now on. There are people who'll be in the crowd next time who can't afford for you to be brave." It was not gentle and it was not cruel. It was just true, the way Mercer was always just true, and Corvell took it the way a man takes the only medicine that will actually heal him. He put out his hand. Mercer, after a moment, took it, and that was the whole of it. "I will tell you the last thing, and then I will let the story rest. The house never did get to honor Eli Mercer the way they wanted to, because he would not have it. But they found a way around him in the end, as institutions do. The new children's wing opened that autumn, and over the door of the small quiet room where they teach the young volunteers water rescue, the boring, unglamorous skill that saves more lives than any other and gets no banners at all, they hung a single plain plaque. It does not name him. He would not allow his name. It bears only a line, and I am told the line was the boy's idea, the boy in the cartoon t-shirt who had asked the question, and finally, in the worst and best afternoon of his young life, received the answer. The plaque reads, "For the boring man who flew into the storm, who taught us that the bravest thing of all is to stand still and be ready." And every morning, somewhere in this country, a guardsman is standing on a step in the cold, doing nothing, while the world walks by and never thinks to wonder what he is holding so carefully, or what he would walk into the water to save. I have stood beside one of them. I know what that stillness is worth. And I have never once, since that afternoon at Highmore, heard the word boring used about a guard without thinking of a wasp-colored aircraft sinking into a brown lake, and the calmest man on the whole lawn handing me his rifle and going in.